The candles in Valharo Palace did not flicker. They burned with a steady, unnatural constancy, as if even flame had learned to hold itself still in the presence of its king. Serafina had noticed this on her first night, 3 months ago, when she had followed the housekeeper, Mistress Colwyn, through corridors so vast and silent that her own footsteps sounded like confessions. She had learnt quickly, do not look up at the portraits. Do not open any door that has no handle on the outside. Do not linger near the east wing after the second bell. And above all, do not be seen after midnight. Serafina was very good at not being seen. It was a skill born from necessity. She had been practicing invisibility since she was 7 years old, when her grandmother had sat across from her at a rough kitchen table and said, in a voice stripped of warmth, "You must never let them find you. Promise me." She had promised. She had kept that promise for 19 years. Tonight, however, something was wrong. She had been sent to the west corridor with a cloth and a bucket of cold water. A punishment, she suspected, from Mistress Colwyn, who had caught her pausing too long near the study door that afternoon. The task was simple: clean the window alcoves before the midnight bell, then return to the servant quarters. She had cleaned 4 alcoves without incident. On the 5th, she had found the door. It was set into the wall between 2 tapestries so old their colors had bled into one another, burgundy and black, and something that might once have been gold. The door had no visible handle, but when Serafina lifted her candle to examine the alcove more closely, the flame bent toward it, as if drawn by breath from the other side. She told herself to keep walking. Her hand touched the wood. The door opened. The room beyond was a library, not the public one on the 3rd floor, where servants were permitted to dust but never to read, but something older and deeper. The shelves were carved directly into stone. The books were bound in materials she did not want to name. The air smelled of iron and old wax, and something floral, hauntingly familiar, like a flower she had only ever been described and never seen. She should have left immediately. Instead, she stepped inside. The book called to her from the center table. That was the only honest way to describe it. A calling. A pull behind her sternum, faint as a distant chord. It lay open as though recently read, its pages dense with script in a language she should not have recognized. But she did recognize it. She had seen it in her grandmother's letters, the ones tied with black ribbon at the bottom of a chest she had carried from village to village for years. She had memorized it without trying, in the way that certain things imprint on a person before they are old enough to resist. The Luminara script. The language of the old bloodline. Her bloodline. Serafina's fingers reached for the page before her mind could intervene. The moment her skin made contact with the parchment, something happened that had never happened before in her careful, suppressed life. Her hand began to glow. Not brightly, not with theater, a soft luminescence beneath the skin, like moonlight caught under water, tracing the lines of her veins from fingertip to wrist. It lasted only 3 or 4 seconds, then faded, but 3 or 4 seconds was more than enough. "What," said a voice behind her, "are you doing in this room?" Serafina went very still. She did not turn immediately. In the space between his question and her response, she understood with perfect clarity that her life had just changed in a way she could not undo. 3 months of careful invisibility, 3 months of gray linen uniforms and downcast eyes and learning which floorboards creaked and which doors stayed unlocked. 3 months of being no one, all of it undone in the light of her own hand. She turned. He was standing in the doorway she had come through, though she had not heard it open again. King Valerian of Valharo. She had seen him at a distance 3 times, once crossing the great hall, once ascending the main staircase, once standing at the window of the upper gallery with his back to the world. Each time she had looked away before he could look back. Now she had no choice. He was taller than he appeared from a distance, or perhaps it was simply the room that made him seem so. The low ceiling, the narrowing shelves, the way the candlelight gathered around him as though uncertain whether to illuminate or flee. His hair was dark and unbound, which surprised her. She had always seen it tied back. His eyes, in this light, were the color of old amber. Not warm, not cold, simply ancient in the way that certain things are ancient, in the way that glass is old, formed under pressure and permanently set. He was looking at her hand. She pulled it against her chest instinctively, as though she could hide what he had already seen. His gaze moved slowly from her hand to her face. He did not appear angry, which was somehow worse than anger. Anger she could have understood. Anger had rules. What was in his expression now was something else entirely. A focused, particular stillness, the kind that precedes not violence but reckoning. "Your name," he said. "Seraphina, your majesty. I was cleaning the alcoves. I did not intend your full name." She hesitated. 1 heartbeat. 2. "Seraphina Vale," she whispered. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He knew the name. She could see it in the single, almost imperceptible shift of his jaw, the only crack in that perfect composure. He knew exactly what name she carried and what it meant, and why it was impossible that she was standing in his palace in servant's grey, with old light still fading from her veins. "Close the book," he said. His voice was very quiet. "And do not move." She closed the book with trembling hands. She did not move. He did not summon the guards. That, more than anything, told her she was in a different kind of danger than the ordinary sort. A servant, caught in a forbidden room after midnight, would be dismissed at best, handed to the coven enforcers at worst. The pale, uniformed men she had seen twice in the courtyard, carrying instruments she had not allowed herself to examine closely. Valerian did neither. He crossed the room and lowered himself into the single chair beside the center table, with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent centuries learning that urgency was indistinguishable from weakness. He regarded her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the low stool near the window. She sat, because refusing was not a choice that existed. He looked at the closed book between them. He had not touched it. His hands rested on the arms of the chair with a particular stillness she had already begun to associate with him. Not the stillness of inaction, but of immense control, of enormous energies held precisely in check. "The veil line," he said at last, not as a question. "I was told it ended. My grandmother told people the same." "Deliberately." "Yes." Something moved in his expression, not warmth. She would not have recognized warmth from him yet, not this early, but something adjacent to it, something that looked more like recognition, the way one ancient thing recognizes another. "How long have you been in this palace?" he asked. 3 months, your majesty." "Under whose employment?" "Mistress Colwyn engaged me in the market town." "I had references." She paused, then added, because it seemed relevant. "They were real references. I did not deceive her about my capabilities. Only your name." I gave her my first name. She did not ask for the rest. His eyes moved over her face with the methodical patience of a man reading a document for the second time, confirming details he had already noted but wished to be certain of. She did not look away. She had learned that looking away was, in its own way, a declaration. "You can read the Luminara script," he said. She said nothing. "That is not a general skill, girl. It is a bloodline inheritance, one which your family spent considerable effort concealing." He leaned forward slightly, only slightly, but the room seemed to rearrange itself around the movement. "What did you come here for? What did you expect to find?" The question hit her somewhere unsteady, because it was the right one. She had not asked herself the same thing with sufficient honesty. She had told herself she came for work, for safety, for the anonymity that proximity to power sometimes provided. A maid in a vampire king's palace was, paradoxically, safer than a woman alone on the road. Safer, at least, from most threats. But the book on that table, the script her grandmother had made her memorize without ever explaining why, the way her hand had reacted as though the text were not foreign but familiar, as though it had simply been waiting for her to return. She had not come for safety at all. "Answers," she said finally. "My grandmother died without explaining what I am. I believe that if the answers existed anywhere, they would be here." The silence that followed was different from the last one, less charged, more considered. "She told you nothing?" he asked. "He told me to hide. She told me never to use the light. She said the bloodline was a curse. She was not entirely wrong. Serafina pressed her hands flat against her thighs, a steadying gesture she had developed in childhood. What is it, then? What am I? He was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer. He looked at the closed book, then at the window, where the grounds lay in deep, motionless darkness. The second bell had already rung. She was hours past where she was supposed to be. The Luminara were not merely a noble human line, he said at last. They were made, cultivated centuries ago by the First Coven, a human bloodline engineered to carry a specific inheritance, the ability to interface with the oldest forms of vampire binding. She listened without speaking. Their blood can confirm oaths, seal covenanters, or, he paused with the weight of something unsaid, it can break them, unravel old bindings entirely, which is why, after the War of the Veiled Courts, the Coven sought to eliminate them. And my grandmother hid. Your grandmother was the only survivor of the last purge. She was young. She was clever. He said this without admiration or cruelty, simply as fact. And she apparently managed to produce an heir without the Coven's knowledge. Is the Coven still looking? Serafina asked. The words came out more steadily than she felt. The Coven believes the line dead. It has believed so for 20 years. He met her eyes. Until tonight. The implication settled over her slowly, the way cold water rises rather than falls. You will not tell them, she said. She had not intended it as a request. It came out closer to one than she liked. I have not decided what I will do, he said, which was honest in a way that frightened her more than a lie would have. What I have decided is that you will not return to the servant quarters tonight. You will remain here until I have thought carefully about what your presence in my palace means. He rose. The chair did not scrape. He was too deliberate for that. There are blankets in the cabinet beneath the east shelf, he said, moving toward the door. The room is warded. You will be safe until morning. He paused at the threshold. Do not open the book again, he said, without turning. Not until I tell you it is safe to do so. Then he was gone, and the door closed without a sound, and Serafina sat in the old light of a library that held the secrets of her own blood, and tried, very carefully, not to be afraid. Morning in Valhero arrived not with sunrise but with a deepening of permission. Some imperceptible loosening of the darkness, the candles burning at a slightly different angle, the stone walls exhaling warmth they had hoarded through the night. Serafina had slept for perhaps 2 hours on the narrow window bench, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of lavender and old cedar and something dry and mineral beneath both. She had not opened the book. She had wanted to. Several times throughout the night she had felt the pull of it. That same sensation behind the sternum, that cord in the dark, and each time she had held herself still by an act of will that cost more than it should have. Her grandmother had spent a lifetime teaching her this, the suppression of instinct, the closing of whatever door inside her wanted, persistently, to come open. You are not the light, her grandmother had said. You only carry it, and what you carry can be taken from you. She heard voices in the corridor before the door opened. There were 2 of them, a woman and a man, speaking in low, formal tones that clipped to silence the moment the door swung inward. The woman entered first. She was tall, angular, dressed in deep blue with silver at the collar, and she wore the particular expression of someone who had spent many centuries learning to find nothing surprising. She looked at Serafina and found her surprising. You are the maid, she said. Not unkindly, but with precision. I am Serafina, she replied. Yes. The woman moved to the center table, glanced at the closed book with an expression more complicated than Serafina could yet read, then looked back. I am Alindra. I serve as the king's counsel in matters of lineage and covenant law. He has asked me to speak with you before he returns. To determine whether I am a threat, Serafina said. Alindra regarded her with something that might have been approval. To determine the appropriate protocol, the 2 are not identical. She settled into the chair Valerian had occupied the night before with the ease of long familiarity. The king tells me you spoke honestly with him. I would ask you to do the same with me. The man who had entered with her had positioned himself near the door, not blocking it, not threateningly, but present in the way that guards are present. Serafina noted him and chose not to look at him directly. "I told him the truth," she said. "I am not certain I know enough of it to be otherwise." "Tell me what you know. Start with your grandmother." She told it plainly because plain was the only version she had. Her grandmother, Marit Vale, born in the Highland provinces, fled south after the night she called only the burning and refused to specify further. A life of constant movement, careful names, careful appearances. She had died when Serafina was 15, leaving her a locked chest. A letter in the Luminara script that Serafina had spent 4 years learning to read, and the address of a distant cousin who was dead by the time she arrived. The letter had told her 3 things. The first, what she was. The second, that there were those who would want to use her, and those who would want to end her. And she must learn to tell them apart before they learned she existed. The third, if she ever needed the answer the letter could not give, the answer to the question of why, of what the Luminara blood was truly for, of what it had once been designed to do, and whether it could be unmade. She should find the source, the first text. The Covenant Library of Valhero. She had not told Valerian this last part. "The letter sent you here," Elendra said. "It was not a question." "Yes. Deliberately. To this library. To this book." She touched the cover of the closed text, lightly, without opening it. "You should know, girl, that no one in this palace has been able to locate this room for 30 years. The wards on it are absolute. The fact that the door opened for you is not incidental." Serafina felt the familiar vertigo of information rearranging what she had understood. The door responds to the bloodline? The rune does. It was built for it. Alendra looked at her with a frankness that felt, in its own way, like a small mercy. "Whatever your grandmother told you about hiding, she was right to protect you. But she was wrong to leave you without preparation. You are not simply a survivor of the Luminara line, Serafina. You are the last complete inheritance. Every other branch was lost or diluted." She paused. "Your blood is the only key that still turns in the lock." The room felt smaller than it had. "What does that mean?" Serafina asked. "It means," said a voice from the doorway, "that there is a covenant in this palace that has been waiting 30 years for someone to complete it or dissolve it. And you are, apparently, the only one capable of either." Valerian stood in the entrance. He had not been there a moment before. She was learning, already, that this was simply how he moved through space. Not dramatically, not with the self-conscious theater of power, but simply present. And then present elsewhere, with no visible interval between. He looked not at Alendra, but at Serafina. "Did she tell you the full context?" he asked his counsel. "She told me enough," Serafina said before Alendra could answer. She was not certain where the steadiness in her voice came from, perhaps from nothing more than the arithmetic of what was left to lose. "I would prefer if you told me the rest yourself." A beat of silence. Alendra's expression shifted, the smallest recalibration. Valerian entered the room. He did not sit. "Then we should begin," he said. He did not begin immediately. He stood at the far end of the table and considered the closed book with the expression of a man revisiting something he had hoped to leave behind. Not quite regret, not quite dread, but the particular gravity that accompanies the reopening of old accounts. Alendra withdrew without a word, drawing the door closed with a soft, final sound. Then it was only the two of them and the book, and the morning light moving reluctantly through stone-framed windows. 30 years ago, Valerian said, I entered into a covenant with an organization known as the Conclave of the Grey, a faction of vampire lords who controlled the eastern trade routes and, more significantly, the passage rights through the Aldenmere passes. The covenant was binding under the oldest lore, sealed by Luminara blood, which was still available to us then, through the last surviving elder of your line. He did not name the elder. She suspected he meant her grandmother. The terms of the covenant were political. They do not matter now. What matters is that the covenant was sealed with a clause, a standard one in those days, requiring renewal within 3 decades, or it would invert. Invert, she repeated. A reversed covenant does not simply dissolve. It transforms the original terms into their opposite and binds the sealing parties to those opposed terms permanently. In this case, he paused, and something in the quality of that pause told her the thing he was about to say had weight. The covenant concerns sovereignty. The inversion would transfer the governing rights of Vale Harrow and the territories under my authority to the conclave. The silence after this was different from those that had come before, more specific. And the Luminara blood is required to renew or dissolve it, Seraphina said. Yes, which is why the coven did not want us dead after all. They wanted us available. She heard the bitterness in her own voice, thin and controlled, but present. The purge your council mentioned was the conclave, he said quietly, not the broader coven. The conclave eliminated the Luminara line to prevent anyone else from using them. They assumed that when renewal time came, they would have positioned themselves as the sole party with access to binding magic. They did not anticipate that the last elder would survive long enough to produce an heir. My grandmother. Yes. Seraphina looked at the book. And you have known this for 30 years? That the covenant was approaching inversion? I have been attempting alternate solutions for 20 of them. Something moved across his face. Not shame, but the acknowledgement of a long exhaustion. The deadline is 7 days from now. 7 days. She absorbed that the way cold absorbs warmth, slowly, then all at once. What do I need to do, she asked. To renew the covenant, which is the outcome I prefer, your blood must be freely given and applied to the text. But the covenant was constructed with a specific clause requiring the Luminara inheritor to be cognizant and uncoerced. You must understand what you are agreeing to. And to dissolve it? The same blood, the same willingness, but directed to the dissolution sigil on the final page rather than the renewal glyph. He looked at her directly. If it dissolves, the covenant becomes void, the conclave loses its leverage, and you would be free to leave this palace with my protection guaranteed. But Vale Harrow loses nothing, she said carefully. Correct. And if it renews? Vale Harrow is secured for another generation. The conclave is bound to their original, lesser terms. He held her gaze. And you would be registered in the covenant record as a participating party, which means the conclave would know you exist. There it was. The cost, laid plainly. To help him was to unmask herself. Seraphina stood and moved to the window. The grounds below were gray-green in the pale morning, enormous and ordered. Hedgerows trimmed with the exactitude of a world that tolerated no natural looseness. A gardener moved along the distant path. Human, she thought. There was something mortal in the unhurried slope of his shoulders. You could compel me, she said, without turning. You are a vampire king. I am technically your servant. Yes, he said simply. I could, but you have not. No. Why? The pause that followed was not evasive. She was beginning to understand simply how he processed things that did not fit into clean categories, by a brief suspension of response, a recalibration of language to honesty. Because a coerced covenant is a weaker one, he said, and because another pause, shorter, it would be wrong. She turned then. He was watching her with that amber and shadow gaze, and there was nothing readable in it, nothing she could confidently name, but it held her in a way that was different from how she was accustomed to being held by anything. Most things that constrained her were external. This felt disconcertingly like it came from the inside. I would like to read the full covenant text, she said, before I decide. Of course. He moved to the table and opened the book, not to the page she had touched, but further in, with the surety of someone who knew these pages by heart, and stepped back, giving her space to approach, space to read without him looming over her shoulder. She came to stand beside the table, and she was close enough now to notice the very faint, very old scar that ran along the inside of his left wrist, the kind of mark a covenant signing leaves. Not a wound. A signature. She had not expected that detail to move her. It did, slightly, in a way she filed away and did not examine further. She began to read. She read for 3 hours without stopping. Valerian did not interrupt her. He removed himself to a chair near the far wall, and she noticed in her peripheral vision, during the rare moments she looked up, did not read, did not pace, did not perform patience. He simply existed in the room with the quality of someone accustomed to long stillness. It was a strange thing to be watched without being studied. Or perhaps he was studying her, and she simply could not detect it. The possibility that she was being observed more carefully than she realized had occurred to her more than once in her 3 months here. But she had always dismissed it as the ambient paranoia of living in a place built for concealment. Now she was less certain. The covenant text was dense, legal in its architecture but old in its language. Luminara script interspersed with the formal Coven dialect, layered in a way that required her to parse each paragraph in 2 registers simultaneously. Her grandmother's patient, relentless drills across kitchen tables and cold rooms, and moving carts had not been a general education. They had been a preparation for exactly this. The realization opened something unsteady in her chest. Mart had known. Not precisely, not with certainty, but she had suspected that eventually Serafina would find her way to a document like this one, the drills, the script, the letter's final instruction. Find the source. Not blind guidance. Deliberate preparation, given without context because context would have been too dangerous to carry. I am sorry, she thought, in the direction of a woman 12 years dead. I didn't understand. She reached the dissolution sigil at the end and studied it for a long time without touching it. Then she turned back to the renewal glyph at the center and studied that. There is a third option, she said. Silence from the far chair. There is a clause here, clause 19, sublotation 3, that allows for partial renewal, a temporary extension, valid for 1 additional year, which does not require registration of the participating party in the public covenant record. She looked up. The conclave would know the covenant had been renewed, but they would not know by whom. He had gone very still. Stiller than usual, which was saying something. I did not notice that clause, he said. It is written in the 3rd layer of the Luminara script. The notation sits beneath the main text, a secondary inscription that requires the bloodline reading to be visible. She met his eyes. You cannot see it without the gift. I can only read it because of what I am. He was quiet for several long seconds. Then he said, Show me where? She turned the book toward him and pointed. He looked at the page with the focused attention of someone attempting to perceive something at the edge of vision. And she watched him fail, watched the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated the text was invisible to him as surely as if it had not been written at all. 1 year, he said. 1 year. Renewable if the participating party agrees to renew again at the end of that term. The conclave cannot demand a full permanent registration during an active temporary extension. It is against the underlying covenant law. She paused. It would buy time. Time for what? Time to find another solution. Time for me to... She stopped, then continued, because stopping felt like cowardice. Time to understand what I am before I commit to anything permanent. He looked at her across the table. The book lay open between them, and the room held its breath in the way that old rooms do when something significant passes through them. Something too weighty to disperse immediately. You are offering to help me, he said. Temporarily, on your own terms. I am offering a middle path. It is not only for your benefit. She kept her voice level. I am in your palace. The conclave may already be watching. The partial renewal protects us both. Us. The word had arrived without calculation, and she noted its arrival. The blood exchange for a partial renewal, he said carefully, is less intensive than a full covenant signing. It requires only a minor opening. The text must receive a small amount of Luminara blood, freely given, consciously offered. No ritual. No ceremony. How minor? He hesitated. A cut on the finger is sufficient. She looked at her hand, the one that had glowed last night, the one she had pressed against her chest as if she could take it back. She had been careful with her hands her entire life. She had been careful with everything. But her grandmother had also spent her entire life being careful. And caution, alone, had not saved her. All right, Serafina said. He rose and opened a narrow drawer in the cabinet beneath the east shelf, retrieving a small knife, silver-handled with a blade so fine it was almost translucent. He set it on the table within her reach, but did not hand it to her directly. She picked it up. The handle was cold and heavier than it looked. She made a small cut on the pad of her index finger, quick and clean the way her grandmother had taught her when she was old enough for such lessons. A bead of dark red appeared. She pressed her finger to the claws on the page. The effect was immediate and involuntary. The luminara light returned, not just in her hand this time, but moving up her arm, tracing the veins in the same soft, subterranean glow. Brighter now for being deliberately offered rather than accidental. The text on the page responded to it, the sabotation rising to visibility, the claws igniting in silver white for a breathless moment before settling into permanence. Done. She lifted her finger from the page. The light faded. The cut had already closed, faster than it should have. Another thing she had always hidden. She looked up at him. His expression was something she had not yet seen on his face. Unguarded, just for a second, before composure reasserted itself. Something between wonder and an old, specific grief. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. "1 year," she said. "And then we renegotiate." The palace changed after that, in ways she could not fully account for. Not dramatically. Valhalla was not a place that permitted drama in its architecture, in its rhythms, in the controlled silence its king moved through like a tide through still water. But something had shifted in the physics of it, and how she fit within its walls. She was no longer simply a maid. She was no longer precisely a servant at all. Aelindra had come to her the next morning with a set of rooms in the Upper East Corridor. Not grand, but private, insulated from the servant quarters by 2 floors and a long, uncrossable habit of separation. A wardrobe of plain but quality clothing had appeared, as if expected. Her cleaning supplies had not. She understood the message. She was not certain how she felt about it. She had spent 3 days quietly learning the palace's rhythms at this new altitude. Meals were brought to her. She was not confined, but she was not precisely free. She moved within an unstated boundary, the way one does when the rules are understood without being spoken. She explored the upper library, full of texts in languages she half recognized and histories she had not been taught. Valerian she saw only twice, once in the corridor on the 2nd day at a distance when he inclined his head in acknowledgement without stopping, once in the evening of the 3rd day, when she had been sitting in the window alcove of her room and looked up to find him standing in the garden below, looking at the sky with an expression of such contained sorrow that she had looked away immediately, feeling she had intruded on something private. On the 4th day, he came to the library where she was reading. He had a habit of arrival, present, and then present elsewhere, but he had begun, she noticed, to make slightly more sound when approaching her specifically. A deliberate adjustment. The first time he had simply appeared in the doorway without warning, she had startled badly, and he had registered her reaction with the particular stillness of a man who had frightened people unintentionally many times and had not fully reconciled himself to it. "There is something you should see," he said. She followed him through corridors she had not previously navigated, down into a lower level of the palace that was neither servant quarters nor administrative wing, but something between. Older, the stone a different texture, the air cooler and more complex. He stopped at a door and opened it. Inside was a room that held on its central plinth a single object, a glass sphere, perhaps the size of a human head, containing what appeared at first to be captured smoke, dark and slowly turning, like weather in miniature. A blood memory vessel, he said, created by the first Luminara elder in the earliest period of the Covenant tradition. It holds a record, not written, but stored in the medium of preserved blood. It can only be accessed by Luminara touch. She looked at him. "Whose memories?" "Your grandmother's." The word landed in her chest like a stone in still water. "She left this here?" "She came to Valhalla once before the Purge. She was very young. She came to study the Covenant law, as her line had always done. She stayed for a season." His voice was level, but she was learning to hear the things beneath the levelness. "When she left, she sealed this vessel and asked that it be kept safe. She said someone of her blood would come for it eventually." Serafina looked at the sphere for a long moment. "She knew I would find it. She knew someone would. She could not have known it would take this long." A pause. "She could not have known it would be you, specifically." She did know, Serafina thought. She had the sudden, vertiginous certainty of it. The specific, non-accidental shape of her grandmother's instructions, the Covenant Library address, the years of script drilling. Maret had not hoped. Maret had planned. She moved to the plinth and placed her hands on either side of the sphere without quite touching it, and felt the pull immediately, stronger than the book, more personal, the sensation of something that had been waiting for her specifically. She looked at Valerian. "Will you stay?" she asked. She had not meant to ask. It came out before she could prevent it, and she heard the vulnerability in it clearly, and did not try to walk it back. He did not answer immediately. And then, yes. She placed her palms on the glass. The memory was not visual, not in any clean way. It came as sensation first. Cold, movement, the smell of burning, and then gradually acquired shape. A village, dark with smoke. Running, her grandmother's hands, much younger, clutching a child who could not have been her mother. A small dark-haired girl who was already a secondary line, already diminished. This is what was lost, the memory seemed to say, not in words, but in the specific temperature of grief. This is what they took from us. Then, clearer, a room, the same library she had first entered through the hidden door. Maret, perhaps 18 years old, sitting across a table from a man Serafina recognized now by posture and stillness even before she saw his face. Valerian. He had been unchanged, as vampires are unchanged, but in the memory there was something else, not romance, not attraction, but the particular quality of two people who had found in each other a form of understanding neither had expected. He knew her, Serafina realized. He knew my grandmother. She pulled her hands from the sphere. Her breath was unsteady. She looked at him and found him watching her with an expression that confirmed it, an expression that held an old loss, the shape of a specific person, old enough to have grown quiet, but not old enough to have disappeared entirely. "You were her friend," Serafina said. "Yes," he said, simply and without apology. The room felt very small and very full. The attack came on the 5th night. She was in her room when the palace changed. Some quality of the air altered. The ward pressure she had learned to feel as a low background hum, going suddenly sharp. She was up and dressed before she had consciously decided to be, her hands finding clothing in the dark with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been waking in unfamiliar rooms and moving quickly her entire life. The corridor outside her door was empty, but there were sounds from the east stairwell. Not violence, not yet, but the sounds of acceleration, fast movement, precise and professional. The sounds of people who knew exactly where they were going. She thought the conclave. She thought 7 days was too long to wait. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. Alindra came through it at a pace that was, for her, the equivalent of a sprint. "They have come early," she said. 4 enforcers, conclave-bound. They are asking, in the formal legal sense, which means demanding, to inspect the Covenant record. Her eyes moved over Serafina with quick assessment. If they see your name absent from the full record, they will know the extension was granted by a surviving Luminara. If they access the room, they will find me, Serafina finished. The king is delaying them in the receiving hall. We have perhaps a quarter hour. Alindra paused, with a question she had clearly not expected to be asking. Can you suppress the light? Serafina considered. Usually, under stress it becomes difficult to control. This will be stressful. I am aware. Alindra looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary. There is a room behind the main library, a listening chamber, used in the early centuries for diplomatic observation. It is not warded, but it is very well hidden. If you are quiet and controlled, you will be invisible there. She paused. I will take you there, but then I must return to the hall. I can find it myself if you show me the entrance. Alindra studied her. Then, follow me. She was in the chamber within 3 minutes, the entrance sealed behind her with a panel that fit so precisely into the wall that even knowing it was there, she would have struggled to locate it from outside. The chamber was narrow and cold, barely large enough to stand in, with a thin horizontal gap at eye level that provided a view of the main library. She pressed herself against the wall and breathed slowly and did not let herself think about the light. They arrived 9 minutes later. 4 of them, as Alindra had said, they wore gray. Not the gray of servants, but the particular gray of institutional authority, the color of rules enforced by those who had made them. 3 moved through the library systematically, unhurried, running gloved hands along the shelves, checking the catalog against what was present. The 4th stood still near the center table. He was older than the others, or rather he had the specific density of greater age, the quality of a candle burned low and still bright. He was looking at the center table with the focused attention of a man who expected to find something. He was looking at the book. She watched him open it, watched him turn to the covenant page, watched him look at the renewal glyph, where the partial renewal inscription had settled into permanence. Watched him turn to the dissolution sigil and find it untouched. He did not look satisfied. He looked like a man confirming a suspicion he had carried for some time. His expression was not surprise. It was the expression of arithmetic, of sums working out. Then he turned, slowly, with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to being the most perceptive person in any room, and looked directly at the panel in the wall behind which Seraphina stood. She did not breathe. She did not let herself think. She let herself become what she had always been trained to be, still, dark, invisible. She suppressed the light with the full weight of 19 years of practice, pressing it down to nothing, holding it there. His gaze moved on. But it moved on slowly, with the thoughtful deliberation of someone filing information for later. They left 14 minutes after they had arrived. She heard their departure through the thin wall, the formal exchange of leave-taking with Valerian in the corridor, the words correct and courteous and threatening in the way that all formally correct words are threatening when spoken by people with enforcement authority. Then silence. Then the panel opened. Valerian stood in the entrance to the narrow chamber, looking at her. She noticed, for the first time, that he looked tired, or whatever the equivalent of tired was for something that did not need sleep. There was a weight to him that had not been there on the first night, a different quality of stillness, less composed and more effortful. "You held the suppression," he said. "Yes, through observation pressure, that is." He stopped. "Most Luminara could not have done that. I have had 19 years of practice." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted from the professional, the king assessing the asset, to something else, something more unguarded. "The lead enforcer will report back that the covenant has been extended, but the party is unidentified," he said. "They will not accept that. They will return. I know. When they return, they will be looking more carefully. I know." A pause. "You could leave. Now, tonight, before they regroup. I would give you safe passage, money, papers, a route south." She looked at him. At the scar on his wrist, barely visible. At the weight behind his eyes that was older than she could calculate. "Would you rather I left?" she asked. The silence before his answer was very brief and very complete. "No," he said. He had stopped counting years somewhere around the 3rd century, when the act of counting had begun to feel less like orientation and more like accumulation of a debt he had not agreed to incur. Time for him was not linear, but textural. Some decades dense and fibrous, others thin as rice paper, and the borders between them rarely where he had expected. But he was aware, with uncomfortable clarity, that the 6 days since the maid had opened the library door were the most densely textured span of time he had experienced in recent memory. He tried to identify the source of this with some precision, because he had learned that emotions which went unexamined had a tendency to behave badly in enclosed spaces. It was not the covenant situation. That was a problem, and a significant one, but problems were familiar. He had spent 30 years with this particular problem, and it produced in him nothing but a low chronic heaviness. It was not Merritt's granddaughter, specifically, not the fact of her, not her bloodline, not even the useful accident of her presence. He had encountered powerful lineages before. What was different was the person. She had, in the manner of the most quietly formidable people, made herself known through accumulation rather than declaration. Each time he had spoken with her, he had come away with a slightly different picture, not because she revealed herself deliberately, but because careful attention to a careful person eventually yielded the shape of them. She suppressed the light with a steadiness that should have been impossible, given her age and the lack of formal training. She had found a clause in a covenant text that had defeated every scholar he had brought to it over 30 years. She had, when given the opportunity to leave, chosen to stay. Not from naivety, he thought, but from some internal calculus that had weighed the options and found departure insufficient. And she had asked him to stay while she held her grandmother's memory. That, specifically, had done something he was not prepared to examine in detail. Not because he was above the examination, he was, if nothing else, honest with himself, but because what it had done was not yet fully formed, not yet patient enough to sit still for analysis. He had known Maret Vale for 4 months, 30 years ago, in the manner of two people who had recognized in each other something rare and chosen to be careful with it. She had been young and brilliant and very specific in her courage, the kind of courageous that does not announce itself. She had left because the world had required it of her, and he had understood, and they had both known. They would not see each other again. He had kept the memory sphere because it was the last thing she had asked of him, and because he had been uncertain what the right thing to do with it was. Uncertain, and then gradually used to its presence, the way one grows accustomed to a grief that has no resolution. Her granddaughter had Maret's hands, the same deliberate economy of movement, the same quality of stillness when still. He had noticed it on the first night, and he had not known what to do with the noticing, and he had filed it under irrelevant without real conviction. He sat now in his study with the third bell ringing somewhere distant, and thought about the enforcer who had looked at the panel in the wall, and what it meant for the time remaining. 1 year was not enough. The partial renewal had bought space, not safety. The conclave would regroup. They would send someone more senior next time. Someone who would not be satisfied with a covenant record inspection and would demand a full lineage audit of every person who had passed through the palace in the renewal period. He needed to think past the next 7 days, past the year. But every time he reached for the longer view, his thoughts returned to a girl in a narrow hiding chamber, pressing herself against stone and holding the light inside, and the particular quality of her voice when she said, "Would you rather I left?" He had said no. He had not said it with sufficient qualification. He thought now, had not attached the appropriate political or practical reasoning that would have made it a strategic answer rather than a personal one. He was not certain he could have attached those qualifications because he was not certain they were the true reason. He made himself stop there. Opened a correspondence that required attention. Let the discipline of routine take over, the way it always had, the way it had carried him through 3 centuries of solitude without breaking him. But when he set the letter down an hour later, unfinished, his thoughts had returned. He found himself standing in the corridor outside her rooms before he had consciously made the decision to go there. He stood long enough to consider the impropriety and the risk and the various reasons not to proceed. Then he knocked. A pause. Movement inside, the sound of bare feet on stone. The door opened. She had been awake, of course she had. It was the middle of the night, and she was Maret's granddaughter, and Maret had also never slept easily in troubled times. She looked at him with the calm wariness that was, he was learning, her resting expression, and waited. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what comes after the year." She opened the door wider. "Come in, then." He entered. She settled in the chair by the window. He stood, he was not yet ready, somehow, to sit in her space as he did in his own, and began to explain what he was considering, and she listened, and she did not interrupt, and the night came in around the edges of the window like a tide. They talked until the 4th bell. She had not expected that. She had expected a tactical briefing. Some version of "here is the longer problem, here is what I am considering, here is what I may need from you." And she had prepared herself for that version, arranged herself into the appropriate listening posture, professional and clear-eyed. But what had happened instead was a conversation, not the exchange of information between a king and an asset, but the kind of talk that begins in one place and discovers, in following its own logic, that it has arrived somewhere neither party intended. He had outlined the situation plainly, the conclave's likely next move, the options available, the year's timeline, and what needed to happen within it. She had asked questions, and the questions had become responses, and the responses had become a thread that neither of them pulled from but also neither let go of. She had told him things she had not intended to tell anyone, about her grandmother's last months, the deterioration, The fear that had finally surfaced after a lifetime of careful concealment, the way Marit had sat by the window in their last shared room and looked at the sky as though expecting something she had already accepted as inevitable. About the years after, moving from distant cousin to distant acquaintance, to strangers' generosity to her own resources, learning the arithmetic of invisibility, about the particular loneliness of hiding a thing that was also yourself. He had listened without offering comfort, which was the right thing to do. False comfort was the noise that filled silence when people were uncomfortable with the truth of it. He did not seem uncomfortable. In return, and with the same unprompted quality, he had said, "I have governed this territory for 260 years. For the first 100, I believe the hardest part was the isolation. The last 160, I have understood that the hardest part is remaining capable of." He had paused in the specific way that meant he was choosing honesty over tidiness, remaining capable of caring about outcomes that extend beyond self-preservation. She had understood exactly what he meant. She had understood it in the place beneath understanding, the place where things land before they are translated into thought. Now it was close to dawn. She could feel it. The way she had always been able to feel certain things. Another Luminara inheritance she had spent years pretending was common. And she was sitting across from him in her room in the small hours of a night that had become something she would remember the shape of. And she was aware, with the clarity of a person who has spent 19 years learning her own interior landscape, that something had changed in the distance between them. Not physically. He was still near the doorway and she was still in the chair, and there had been no touch, no approach, none of the theater of proximity she had been trained to be wary of. But the distance was different. She had felt it close, not in the way of danger, but in the way of something that had been open and was now being considered for closing, considered carefully, without the performance of casualty. He rose to leave. She saw the intention gather in him the way intention does in someone who has long practiced managing their own movements, a subtle shift of weight and attention. "Valerian," she said. He stopped. She had not used his name before. She had noticed in saying it the slight irregularity of the sound, the name worn down to something smooth and essential. Ancient in the way that names can be ancient. "You said the conclave will send someone more senior," she said. "Someone who will demand a lineage audit." "Yes, if they audit the palace records and find a servant girl named Seraphina Vale, it will not take them long." She nodded slowly. "Then the concealment is over, regardless. Sooner or later, they will know I am here." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I am sorry for that. If I had not come," she said, "the covenant would have inverted in 7 days, and we would both have worse problems than the conclave knowing my name." She paused. "I am not sorry I came. I want you to know that." Something in his expression shifted, that brief, unguarded quality, the one that appeared so rarely she had begun to mark its occurrences carefully. "What I want to propose," she continued, "is a formal arrangement, not under the covenant record, something separate, private, a declared alliance between the Luminara line and Vile Harrow." She held his gaze. Not a transaction, not an asset arrangement, an actual alliance between equals with stated terms and mutual obligations. He was very still. "It would give me defined standing," she said, "something the conclave cannot negate by questioning my employment status. And it would give you," she paused, found the right word, "continuity, someone who can read what you cannot read, see what you cannot see, for more than a year." The silence that followed was long and full of the kind of thinking that does not show on faces. Then he crossed the room, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the specific deliberateness that meant the movement had been decided after full consideration, and stopped before her chair and held out his hand. Not his left hand, not the scarred wrist. His right. An offer. A gesture between equals. She looked at it, at the long fingers and the pale skin and the evident care with which he held the gesture steady, not performing patience but genuinely waiting. She placed her hand in his. His grip was careful, not tentative, not restrained, but careful. The difference being that careful holds what it has, holds it fully, without crushing or grasping. "Stated terms," he said. mutual obligations, an actual alliance. Yes, she said. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. Not a caress, barely even an acknowledgement. The smallest possible excess of a gesture that was otherwise entirely formal. She felt it precisely. Agreed, he said. He had not signed his name to anything in 30 years that had felt, upon signing, like possibility rather than liability. He was aware, walking the palace in the hour before the conclave's senior envoy was due to arrive, that what he felt was something he did not have a fully updated vocabulary for. It had been several generations since he had needed the vocabulary. He had cultivated its absence carefully, the way one cultivates the absence of a habit that was once destructive, building in its place the cleaner architecture of governance and duty. But there was no useful word for standing in the upper corridor before dawn and feeling, against all strategic calculation, that the next several hours held the possibility of something other than preservation. He stopped at the window. The grounds were gray and still in the pre-morning. 30 years ago, Maret had stood in the garden below and looked up at this window. He remembered it with the photographic fidelity that vampire memory afforded the things it chose to keep. She had looked up, and she had said, "You are very good at watching things from behind glass." He had understood the criticism. He had not, at the time, had a sufficient answer for it. He thought perhaps the answer was late rather than absent. Seraphina dressed with care, not the care of vanity. She had never had the leisure for vanity, but the care of a person who understood that what they wore today was a statement of posture, of position, of how they intended to be read. She chose the darkest of the clothes from her wardrobe, a deep charcoal gray that was close enough to the servant uniform that she might once have worn it as one, but cut differently, worn differently, without the uniform's deliberate erasure of individuality. She wore her grandmother's ring. She had not worn it since leaving the last shared room. It had lived in the bottom of her bag for years. Too identifiable. Too risky. But the concealment was over, as she had told him last night, and there was a thing her grandmother had understood, that she was only now learning the full meaning of. That you cannot defend what you have not claimed. The conclave's envoy arrived at the second bell. He was more senior than she had anticipated. She could see it in how Valerian greeted him, in the particular quality of Ailindra's stillness, in the way the receiving hall rearranged itself around his presence with the subtle shift of a room acknowledging power. He was old in the way that important things are old, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never, in several centuries, been uncertain of his welcome. His name, Alindra had told her, was Marivith. He had been present at the original covenant signing. He had known, personally, every Luminara elder who had ever participated in a Vale Haru covenant. He had, almost certainly, been present at the purge. Seraphina stood beside Valerian in the receiving hall, and did not allow herself to feel anything until the moment had passed for feeling, which was a technique she had learned from her grandmother and had used more reliably than any other tool in her possession. Marivith looked at her for a long cataloguing moment. She watched him arrive at her identity, watched the precise sequence of recognition, confirmation, implication. And she held still through it and did not let the light come. "The Luminara line," he said, not loudly, not with theater, simply as an identification. "My name is Seraphina Vale," she said. "Allied to the House of Vale Harrow under formal declaration, I am here to confirm the covenant record at the request of the allied household." Marivith looked at Valerian. "The alliance is formally declared?" he asked. "It is," Valerian said. His voice was even, and she heard beneath the evenness the specific weight of someone who has chosen their words deliberately. The Luminara alliance with Vale Harrow predates the conclave's jurisdiction by 3 centuries. The revival of that alliance is consistent with the original framework of covenant law. A pause. "You may consult Alindra on the legal precedents if you wish." Mariveth was silent for a long time, long enough that someone less practiced at stillness might have spoken into the silence, might have filled it with explanation or defense. Seraphina did not speak. Valerian did not speak. Finally, Marivith said, "The conclave will not recognize an undocumented alliance as superseding the covenant registration requirement. The conclave is welcome to present that argument to the covenant court," Ailindra said, from her position near the wall. I have prepared the relevant filings. Another silence. Marvith looked at Seraphina again, and this time his look was longer and more complex. Not the cataloging of a moment before, but something more layered. Something that held, she thought, traces of a recognition she had not expected. He had known her grandmother. He had known the last Luminara elder as a young woman, as a person, before the burning. She wondered what he saw in her face. The conclave will require time to deliberate, he said at last. Of course, Valerian said. The declaration will await their formal response. Marevith left. He was courteous in leaving, which she suspected was its own form of warning, the courtesy of those who can afford it. When he was gone and the receiving hall had emptied of all but the two of them, Seraphina exhaled slowly. Valerian stood beside her without moving for a moment. Then he turned his head and looked at her, and what was in his face was not relief. She had expected relief, or something adjacent to it, but something quieter, something that had the quality of an arrival, as though a thing that had been traveling toward this moment for a long time had finally come to rest. The court process will take months, she said. Yes, and the conclave will not accept it cleanly. No, it will not be simple. She thought about that, about months, and the difficulty of not simple and the long corridor of time that stretched ahead of both of them, unresolved, complicated, full of legal machinery and ancient power struggles and the slow, grinding work of rebuilding what had been lost. She thought about a girl at a kitchen table, learning a dead language by candlelight, making a promise to a woman who had planned further ahead than any single life had a right to. I don't mind difficult, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, I know. She looked at him, at the palace around them, the candles burning without flickering, the stone walls exhaling warmth, the long history of it pressing in from every surface like the weight of a kept promise. She was not invisible here. She was not a servant in gray. She was not the last known survivor of a dead line, hiding in corridors and suppressing her own light. She was Seraphina Vale, and she had claimed it. Whatever came next would come to someone who had already decided not to disappear. Beside her, Valerian lifted his hand, the same one he had offered her the night before, the formal one, the careful one, and held it in the space between them. Not quite an offer this time, something more. She placed her hand in it. The candles burned, steady and unflickering, in a palace that had finally, after 30 years, been given something to protect.